are we at in the night? How do we ever know afterlife? I don't think I'll ever find my way back again, and I don't mind.
If you're familiar with me and my channel, you know that I love all kinds of cameras. I'm not like married to one certain brand. All of my video stuff, it's Sony primarily, but my primary stills camera has been the Leica Q2 for the last, I don't know, almost 4 years. But ever since the Nikon ZF was announced, it was the first time where I actually looked at a Nikon camera twice. And not because I thought Nikon cameras were any less than any other brand. It was just like Canon. They'd never really inspired me or interested me before. So when this camera was announced, I was immediately struck by how different it looked to a lot of modern cameras, because my gripe with a lot of modern cameras is not the image quality or the ergonomics or low ISO performance or how high I can get the ISO. It's mostly of how it makes me feel while taking the photos. And that's why I primarily use the Leica Q2, just because of how the camera feels and how I feel about shooting that camera. So it's not going to be a comprehensive review of this camera. I'm not going to go over spec sheets or anything like that, but I am going to go over my experience of what it's been like shooting with this camera for the last 6 months. My day job is a wedding photographer and videographer, so I've actually used this in a couple of weddings already, and a couple of engagement sessions, in a maternity session. So I've had quite a bit of experience using this in a professional setting. So it'll be not just my personal stuff, but also some professional opinions about this camera. So right off the bat, what I want to talk about is the design of this camera, because that's exactly why I kind of was drawn to this camera. I'm not a big film shooter, so it's not because I felt like some kind of nostalgia over like having this feel like film, but I'm always drawn to like that styling, that retro styling of cameras, which is why I was drawn to the X100VI when the camera was released. I did pick one up and ended up selling it just because it didn't fulfill what I wanted that camera to be for, but it was exactly why I picked up the Nikon ZF, because of the retro styling. I know that a lot of older cameras just have that certain look that I really like, and that inspires me to pick them up. So like I said, I don't have a lot of experience shooting film, but I did do a video a couple of years ago where I shot film with 3 different cameras, and the Nikon is one of those, which I borrowed from my father-in-law, and I really like the handling of that camera. So yeah, when this was announced, I was immediately drawn of how much it looked like that camera. And I'm not advocating for picking up a camera just because it looks cool, but it really adds on a lot to the experience. So it's a little bit chunkier than like my Sony a7 IV, but I really like the retro dials here. I like the fact that this is a flippy screen, so I can still use it for weddings, but I can just tuck it away if I don't need it for when I'm shooting, when I'm out doing personal stuff, which is primarily how I use this camera. I shut off the screen here, and I primarily use the EVF. And the build quality of this camera is really good, especially with the brass dials. Like some of the camera feels a little bit plasticky, like the bottom plate here, like the battery compartment does feel a little plasticky. But other than that, like I really love the way that this, the heft of this camera, it feels a lot like kind of the way Leica cameras feel like. They have a nice heft to it. And it's not really like a con for me, because as a wedding photographer, I'm kind of used to carrying like a lot of cameras. And whenever I'm not shooting weddings, like just shooting with one camera with a small lens, it really doesn't feel like any more heavy than like more compact cameras. What I really liked about the Nikon ZF is the quality of this EVF. A lot of cameras in this price point, I'm not the biggest fan on using the EVF, primarily because I'm used to like the Sony a7 IV. And while I love shooting with the a7 IV because it's reliable, I get really good images at wedding days, the EVF I am not a big fan of shooting with that EVF, because it feels like I don't really get a good representation of what the final outcome of the photo is going to look like. And with the Nikon ZF, the EVF is very bright, it's accurate, and so it is a joy to use, not because it's the sharpest one, but it's the most accurate for this kind of price point in camera. So I've been a big fan of the EVF. It is a little bit softer, I would say, than like the Sony a7 IV. It's not something that really bothers me all that much, although I really enjoy shooting with this camera, and I really like the placement of the dials because it is such like a nostalgic feel. One of my gripes with this camera is the lack of like custom buttons. I could use like maybe one or two more custom buttons for whenever I am shooting out professionally. When I'm doing stuff for my personal work or when I'm doing out with my family, it's not really a big deal. But I do wish that it had a couple more custom buttons, especially because some of the layout I'm not the biggest fan of. For example, like there's not a good way to right out of the box to set your to turn on auto ISO, and luckily there's a lot of videos out now where it helps you to customize your camera, and I'll link a couple of videos. I'm not going to go over it here because some people have done really good videos on it. So Omar, I forget his last name, but Omar made a couple of Nikon videos which were really helpful when I was trying to customize this camera. So the way I have auto ISO set up in my camera is by pressing the movie record button and then flicking this front dial. You go from auto ISO to manual ISO, and you can actually use the back dial to set your ISO. So it's super handy to do that. I don't like the way that you have to go through like hoops to kind of set that up. I'm not a big fan of that, but other than that, I think having a couple more custom buttons would help out a lot, especially by just setting one of those custom buttons to turn on and off your ISO. One thing I've seen a lot online about this particular camera is kind of the lack of the grip. And while I do see that it's an issue if you're using this professionally, and if you're someone who shoots a lot continuously back to back, honestly, I'd never use this camera with a grip. I do own a couple of grips, which I don't ever use unless I'm using this for a job. Primarily because whenever I'm out shooting by myself for personal stuff, I'm just shooting a random shot here and there. I don't have very heavy lenses. There are times where I do want to bring a zoom lens for when I'm out with my family. And for those instances, I do have a grip that I like to put on here, but it is not something that I put on every single day. And although I don't use it all the time, I think if you are shooting with this camera, either professionally or for your personal work, it is a worthwhile investment to get a grip for it because it can be an issue. Although I just want to stress that it is not something I feel like you need to use on a daily basis, but it's something that is nice to have. And I don't want to frame it as like blaming users because everybody's experience with this camera is a little bit different. People have different size hands, but I do find it, for me, as someone who has smaller hands, I do like the option on having a substantial grip if I need it, but taking it off if I want to have a smaller camera, especially with this Nikon 28mm f2.8 lens. It's such a small lens, and so it makes the whole kit a lot smaller if I want to use it that way. So adding a grip to it, it just kind of bulks it up even more, which I don't mind if I need it, but whenever I don't need it, it is nice that it can be a little bit more slim. And I'm not going to go over all the different grips. So you can get like, I have this grip from Newer. I also own the one that's from Small Rig. And honestly, I don't think you can go wrong with either one of them. This one feels a little bit more plasticky, but if you want something that kind of matches the camera a little bit better, I definitely recommend using the small grip one. But I do like to use this grip with this camera quite a bit, especially when I'm using like manual focus lenses because it kind of makes it look even more retro. Like it adds a little bit more grip to the camera, makes it look a little bit cooler, but honestly it's mostly for aesthetics. But yeah, I think it's definitely a worthwhile investment to get a grip or two. And since I'm talking about the handling of this camera, I do want to go over some of the customized buttons that I've used. So for instance, this front custom button, I've mapped it to white balance, and by using this rear wheel, I'm able to go through all the different white balances. And honestly, this is my first Nikon camera. I find that the white balance is actually very good in this camera, so I don't find myself fiddling with it a bunch, especially when I'm not shooting for personal stuff. I find the auto white balance very accurate, which I'm not used to because a lot of my other cameras I have to fiddle with white balance, my Sony's, my Leica. So it's quite refreshing to be able to pick up a camera and kind of trust the auto white balance. But if I need to like dial it in, it's really easy for me to do so. So this is kind of where I'm getting a little frustrated because down here you do get a dedicated zoom button if you're like manual focusing and stuff, but it's such an awkward placement for it if you're using manual focus lenses. So I mapped it to this one up here, and while it's really useful, it's really frustrating because I can't really map these two to anything else. I wish that I could customize this camera a little bit more. Even if you don't add more buttons, at least make all of the buttons customizable for other things. That would help a lot of the functionality of this camera and some of the gripes I have with it. I'm also a big fan of the screen. It's really accurate and it's bright enough for me, especially in bright sunlight. I find it that it gets pretty bright. There's a couple of different options that you can get for this camera. For when you go into the menu, you can go to monitor brightness. So this is the default brightness, and you can dial up to all the way to 5 and then high 1 and high 2. The brightness on this screen is actually very, very good, especially in bright sunlight. So when I'm shooting in the middle of the day, it's really useful to have. Another reason why I was interested in shooting with the Nikon ZF, it was the lower megapixel sensor, which is crazy to say because a lot of these new modern cameras go to like the Sony is 32 megapixels, my Leica is 46 megapixel, 47 megapixels, the Fujifilm X106 is 42. I don't exactly remember what numbers it is, but all these sensors have such high megapixel counts that for people like me who like to shoot a lot, those files add up. And while hard drive space is a lot more cheap these days, sometimes I don't want to have 47 megapixel size files all the time, especially if I'm doing stuff for personal work. And so I find that the 24 megapixel sensor on the Nikon ZF is like that perfect sweet spot for me. It still gives me a little bit of room if I want to crop, but the file sizes aren't like ridiculously huge. And the files that I'm getting out of this camera, they're really beautiful. I'm honestly really shocked that I like the Nikon JPEGs as much as I do because, like I said, I don't have a lot of experience shooting with Nikon cameras, but I find that the JPEGs that I get out of this are some of my favorite right out of the camera colors. I don't know what they're doing with the color signs or the specific recipe that I use for this, but I find that I really like the photos that are just right out of the camera, especially because I do like to give my family photos that I take, and not everybody's a big fan on like an artist's interpretation. So like not everybody loves having tons of color shifted all over the place. Some people just want to have a nice picture, a nice portrait of like aunts and uncles or the kids. So I find that the JPEGs straight out of the camera are really nice. The only thing I did to this camera when I bought it was tweak the rich portrait setting. So my JPEGs are just set to rich tone portrait with some minor tweaks, and that's about it. I installed a couple like recipes that you can find online, and I'm not going to talk about that much because I really did not use them at all. Like they're cool to have, and like if you're coming from like Fujifilm, like there are some options, although it's very limited. So if you want to customize things right from camera, this is not the camera for you. There's not even like a grain setting if you want to like add some grain in post. So, and again, like that's like the theme of like my gripes with the camera. I wish there was a little bit more options if you want them, especially for me, because I really like the colors of the straight out of the JPEGs, but I would love to like add some grain in post if I wanted to shift, like have like an S curve or something minor that I can do to the image to like customize it just a little bit more and be done with the JPEG, just because having those options in camera are really useful. And another thing I'm really a big fan of is like this monochrome switch, this black and white switch on the camera. And when I bought the camera, I thought it was a cool option, honestly. I thought it was really cool to have a dedicated spot for it, especially because on my Leica Q2, I do like to set my camera to black and white and still have the full color raw file. And having a physical switch on a camera, it feels like something that would have been done like 20 years ago. And I'm really happy that it's here because it's something I use all the time. And again, the reason I use it all the time is because I'm a big fan of the monochrome picture profile that Nikon has. I don't really tweak it at all. I just wish I could add a little bit grain to it, but I'm a big fan of it. It's just the right amounts of contrast for me. So yeah, it's a big win for Nikon. I just wish that we could customize things just a little bit because the stuff that we have is so good. Customizing them just a tiny bit would go a long way. So like I said, I'm a Sony shooter, so autofocus is a pretty important part of like my workflow. I'm used to and relying on autofocus all the time, especially for weddings. And I'm happy to say that the autofocus in the Nikon ZF is actually very good. If you're using native lenses, it is really snappy. All the different options that you can use to focus on your subject. The tracking is very reliable, especially with a toddler. I find that some cameras can't keep up. And as much as I try to make the X100 VI work, it just wasn't enough for my toddler. My toddler just loves to run around. And I'm happy that this camera can actually keep up with him. It locks onto him really, really well. And so having used this primarily for personal stuff and some weddings, the autofocus is something that I can really trust. To be completely honest, when I first bought the camera, I didn't really use it all that much. I really liked it in the first week or so, but when I got really busy with work and stuff, like it was really nice to have like as a C camera, and it, like I said, it works really well for that. And I couldn't figure out why I wasn't gelling with the camera very much. And then it wasn't until I started adapting lenses to the camera, it kind of, a different world opened up, and it kind of made me fall in love with the system itself. So for me, the funnest part about owning the Nikon ZF is how versatile it is. And because it is kind of like a retro styling camera, adapting manual focus lenses to this camera has been, I don't know, it's been the most fun I've had with a camera in a long time. And I know I've said that in previous reviews of other cameras just because I enjoy gear, but as in terms of manually focusing on like digital cameras, it's never been the most enjoyable experience for me. But adapting different lenses to this camera has just opened up a new world of possibilities, and I've been having so much fun doing so. So what's been fun is adapting vintage glass, and there's a ton of different like cheap adapters that you can use for your lenses. Like this one, I think it was like 20-30 bucks, and I have a couple of old Nikon lenses that I borrowed from my father-in-law. So you can just add it to the adapter, and then adding it to the actual camera, it's relatively pretty simple. I mean, you can pretty much adapt vintage glass on any type of body, but there's just something about using vintage Nikon glass on a like retro style body that just makes the whole experience feel a little more cohesive. And while I'm not a big fan of like this huge adapter, you definitely need it for it to work. So I've had a lot of fun actually using a lot of manual focus lenses. So you follow my work, I go to Disneyland all the time. I took this camera with this lens, and I got a bunch of really cool pictures that it was really nice to see from like a different kind of styling, because a lot of my theme park stuff is very modern looking. It was really cool to be able to shoot with such a lens with such character. So adapting different lenses has been a lot of fun. And like I said, there's a bunch of different adapters for different lenses that you can use. So for example, last month I borrowed a Leica M10 that I used for a couple weeks. If you haven't watched that video, it's the last video I posted. I'll link it somewhere if you want to watch that. So after trying a Leica M digital body, my first thought was like, well, I gotta save up for a Leica M camera, maybe a Leica M10. And while I still would want an M body eventually in the future to add it to the kit, so what I did end up picking up was a Typoc lens for M mount. And I know they make a Z mount version of this lens, but what's been really cool to do is that for the Z mount, there's this Tecart adapter. It's the Tecart TZM02 adapter, which makes M glass lenses autofocus, which I had no idea it existed until a month ago, thanks to a couple users on Thread. So after I picked up this lens, and adapting it to this Tecart adapter, and then adapting it to the Nikon ZF. This has been the most fun aspect of owning this camera, just using M-mount lenses on this camera while having some sort of autofocus. If you want like an actual review of this Tecart adapter, I can make a dedicated video. And this adapter is super cool because the autofocus is not happening in the lens, it's happening through the adapter. It's actually moving the lens back and forth to find focus. And the reason I really like this whole setup is I know there's some gripes about this specific lens because of this focusing, this manual focusing tab at the bottom. It's not really a tab, it's more like a little nub. And that if you go past a certain point, it locks it into infinity. But for this specific adapter, you have to set your manual focus lens to infinity, and then the TechEd adapter does all the focusing for you. So having it locked, and for me not to be able to kind of get into it, it's a really big plus. I know that it's not the most popular thing in the world to have like this locking mechanism if you're just primarily using this these manual focus lenses just to manually focus. But for this specific adapter, it's a really cool combo. So I've been getting some of my favorite shots with this specific combo. I took this camera with this specific setup to Hawaii last month, and I've gotten some of my favorite family photos that I've gotten just because I really like the way that this particular lens renders color. I also picked up this lens, which I'm kind of on the fence about. It's a really cool concept, this collapsible lens. And look how tiny that is. Like, this is such a cool looking camera. And again, I don't want to tell people to pick up certain cameras just because they look cool, but man, it's such a cool looking combo once it's out and about and you can actually autofocus with this. But also, you don't need this adapter if you want to manually focus with your M-mount lenses. They have a couple of, dummy adapters. This is from TT Artisans. This is from Earth. And I'm not going to make a dedicated video on these like little adapters, especially since they're manual focus adapters from Z to M mount. So I'm going to spoil it here. They're the same. So this is, I think, $30. This is $70. It is built a little bit better. So if you kind of care about this sort of thing, go with the Earth one. But if you want to save a little bit of money and you don't really care about that kind of thing, the TT Artisan is really cool. I really like the styling of it, to be honest. Like, and now you have a fully manual focus experience with the Z mount, and it all looks pretty cohesive. I think it's a really cool look. And for people who are interested in what that looks like with the other type of the lens, I think it's such a cool looking combo. Again, I'm still on the fence whether or not I'm gonna keep this. And disclaimer, these lenses, no one paid me to talk about these lenses. I am not affiliated with anybody. I just really wanted to try a 28mm manually focused lens, and this one really caught my eye. So if you want a dedicated video on a Type-Op lens or any specific lenses, let me know. But yeah, I've been having a lot of fun just adapting manually focused lenses on the system. One thing I almost forgot to cover about manually focusing on this camera is how incredibly easy Nikon makes it to nail your focus. And I don't have a lot of experience manually focusing with a lot of cameras, so correct me if I'm wrong, but the way that Nikon does it, which I'm really appreciative of for someone who wears glasses, is that you can still move your focusing point around just like you would if you were autofocusing. But if you are trying to nail your focus with like focus peaking, you can move your point around, and then you can actually use your zoom in button to zoom into that particular spot in your scene, which is super useful because I'm not always the most confident when I'm manually focusing, especially if I'm shooting at like a 1.8 or something. So I'm not sure if other camera manufacturers do that. And if they don't, I really hope that other people kind of copy this feature because it's super useful for someone like me. But I am still not done talking about adapters. So to go over what I've been talking about for the last, I don't know, this is going to be a long video. We got a M to Z adapter for autofocus if you want to do that, which is really handy to have. You also have dummy adapters from M to Z to adapt your M mount glass. You have a bunch of different adapters for tons of different mounts for all different lenses for the Z mount. This is from Nikon vintage glass lenses, but the adapter I've been using the most is this super thin adapter, which still blows my mind. It takes my E-mount glass from my Sony cameras and lets me adapt them to Z-mount with full autofocus. So like, for example, I mean, this is the biggest lens I own. This is the 35 millimeter, 35 to 150 Tamron lens, which I use all the time at weddings. And I've actually used it for weddings. I mount this for long periods of time on this lens, on this actual mount, and it works perfectly. So now this is a Sony lens on a Nikon body, on a Z-mount body with full autofocus. And using it professionally, I find that the autofocus, it's very good. It's definitely not as fast as native mount, but I find that it's negligible, especially if you're doing for video. Like, I haven't really had any issues with this particular adapter. So like, the adapter is tiny, like it almost feels like it's like a native mount lens. And so for someone like me who shoots primarily with Sony, having a backup body that's both fun and that's super functional for gigs, like, it was a no-brainer. And it's something that, like, I thought about when I bought it, but once I got this adapter, it was like game over. It was definitely a good investment on my end because I really enjoy the system, and just putting all of my Sony glass on a different body is just, to me, it's like the coolest thing in the world. And if I really want to take this camera with me and make it as small as possible, I just take this 28 millimeter native Z-mount lens, stick it on the camera, and we're back to this tiny little package. So I'm sure a lot of people on my channel, and who particularly clicked on this video, are more interested in the photo aspects of this camera, but as a videographer, having a camera that also shoots video very well was really important to me. So this camera shoots in 10-bit video. So if you are a videographer and you want to match these colors to like Sony, for example, like I do, it's very good. I haven't had any issues color matching between the two lenses, between the two systems. And the video that comes out of this is actually really beautiful. And what's been cool for me is, like I said, adapting vintage glass to the camera and just giving my footage a different look that I would get with my Sony footage. So it's been really cool, kind of sort of matching both of those aspects of it. And if you're interested, I do want to kind of give you a little preview of what kind of that looks like, kind of matching both matching a Sony and a Nikon in a kind of wedding video style. So this is a teaser for a wedding I did in April. So I'm not going to tell you which is which. I just want to kind of show how you can color match the actual footage. So there's a wedding I did back in April. So the video aspects on this camera, they're very comparable with my Sony a7 IV. It still has like pretty bad rolling shutter, just like the Sony has. There's no internal RAW recording. So matching both of these cameras, I kind of expected that. So it's not something that really bothers me. One thing that does bother me about the monitor and the EVF in this particular camera for video is that it's a lot harder to nail exposure in video mode, because the LUT that Nikon uses is really harsh in this. So I find that I find that it's really hard to get proper exposure if you're just kind of trying to see what your camera sees. This camera does have those typical exposure settings that you can use, like waveforms or zebras. So if you're comfortable using those things, it's not really a big deal. I just wish that you could see exactly how your exposure is going to look like from the back of the camera, because that's usually how I do it with the Sony. Battery on the Nikon ZF is actually really good as well. I saw online that it's like rated for like 600 shots. I don't know if it's that high, but I definitely believe it, because on my wife's birthday was a couple weeks ago, and I took this, I shot with it all day, never had to go on a second battery. So I definitely believe it, because I shot at least 500 something shots, both manually focusing, autofocusing. So yeah, definitely the battery life is great on this. For video, it's okay. It's comparable to like my Sony's. I definitely will get a couple if you're gonna shoot this primarily for video. I don't know a lot of people who are shooting with the Nikon ZF just for video, but if you are shooting it, definitely have at least a couple if it is your backup camera. If you're interested in any of the accessories I talked about, any of the adapters or the lenses or the Nikon itself, I do have links in the description if you want to pick any of this stuff up. I do want to make some dedicated videos on some of the stuff, so let me know what you would like to see in the future. If you want me to make a video on particular lenses or adapters, please leave them in the comment section below. And again, yeah, thank you so much for watching this week's video. It's a pretty long one and a little rambly, so I'm sorry if it's on the longer end, but I hope that you got something out of it. If you're looking to pick up this camera, if there's something I didn't cover, please leave in the comment section below. I'll try to get back to you. And yeah, if you like videos like this and you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you next time.